Welcome to the Ignite Podcast, where we introduce thought leaders and subject matter experts that you'll want to consider for your next corporate event. Now, here's your host, Dennis Warden.
Well, we want to welcome to the Ignite Podcast, Kristin Messerli. Kristin, it is awesome to have you on our Ignite Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Matt and I have had the privilege of hearing you speak several times and have always enjoyed it and got a glimpse certainly into the real estate and mortgage industry from a different perspective that you bring with regard to millennials and the multicultural aspect of it. So that's always been interesting. So I'm looking forward to this time together today as we dig in a little bit into, what you speak about, what you do, but also, a little bit about how this pandemic that we've all been through has impacted, especially in the millennial community. But first off, let me just introduce Kristin as the founder and managing director of Cultural Outreach Solutions. And she specializes in helping companies and mortgage industry better reach and serve multicultural and millennial home buyers. And Kristin's expertise is in multicultural marketing, millennial home ownership, compliance, diversity, and I'm sure much more. But and we have something in common. We have at least at one point shared Oklahoma as our home state. And also California, which is where you're headquartered and living now out of Southern California. So again, welcome to the Ignite Podcast. Anything I missed in regard to our introduction, Kristin?
I don't think so. I have a column on Housing Wire now where I'm talking about a lot of these topics, so people can check that out. And
how do they find that?
Just on Housing Wire, if you search for my name, Kristin Messerli, you can see all my past articles.
Okay. Well, let's talk about who is your primary market that you speak to, and what is the message you bring, and how does it really impact both the those that perhaps are in ownership, but those that are also just in the work of the mortgage or real estate industry?
Yeah, so I speak, as you said, in mortgage and real estate on the topic of reaching millennials and underserved segments. And my message really is around how do you build trust and build relationships in these markets that often are very distrusting of the mortgage and real estate industry. Especially in our generation who grew up or entered adulthood during or right after the financial crisis, there is a whole lot of distrust around the housing industry. And actually, we just did a survey of 1,000 millennial home buyers last week, which the study hasn't been released yet, but we found some of the top concerns of millennial home buyers are whether or not they would get sold to if they talk to a loan officer and get sold into like the wrong kind of product, or they feel unprepared to have that conversation. And then another one is a fear around whether there could be another housing crash and financial crisis. So just, thinking about the lens through which this generation views homeownership is one of distrust, which is why I think it's so important to have these conversations around how do you build trust, but also when this generation grew up with, technology at our fingertips and talking about some of the ways that impacts how we have conversations today.
Well, one of the things that comes to mind for me is, what percentage of the market is made up by the millennial home buyers, and then how does that impact certainly the real estate market today? Maybe more specifically, how does that impact the real estate agent? And because you're right. We've got Zillow out there. We've got so many places to go. We can buy our car online and not even have to leave the house, right? It just shows up, and if we like it, we keep it. If not, we send it back. So it is a different time that way. But how is that impacting the real estate agent, and kind of speak into that?
Yeah, so one of the biggest shifts that's happened is this idea of consumer empowerment, where we know that we can Google any question we have, we can order anything we want online. I actually was traveling so much for speaking engagements before the pandemic happened that I had put all my stuff in storage, and then quickly when we went into lockdown, I've ordered everything I needed online and ordered even my stuff from storage to come to the place that I had rented temporarily during this time. And so, you have access to these types of things at your fingertips. And I think that really changes how we view our relationship with a real estate agent or a mortgage professional. And so one of the things that I think is important on the agent side, especially, is to think about how you can add value outside of just the MLS listings. Like, how are you guiding them through this process? How are you, helping them to negotiate through this process? And so an explanation from the loan officer and the real estate agent from the very beginning of what your role is really crucial, because you don't want to be on the side where you're just seen as a transaction. You want to be seen on the side of, I'm a guide for you through this process. Because for a lot of millennials, we do start our search online and we get very overwhelmed. And so that's something I've heard a lot from millennials. And even though, as you mentioned, the size of the market, I mean, 1 in 3 home buyers today are millennials. So there's a lot of people in the market, but I honestly think there's a lot of other people that would be in the market, but just feel overwhelmed in their initial search online. And so, one of the ways to really retain leads is by, like, as soon as you get that lead, to have a meeting where you're talking about what the home buying process looks like, what they can expect, and giving the consumer a sense of control and full transparency in that process.
So one of the things you talked about earlier was this whole aspect of trust. So how do we build trust? It starts out online, the relationship, starts out online, and then somehow we end up with either a mortgage broker, we end up with a real estate agent. It's either been somebody referred to us or we found them online. But then how is that trust? How is that relationship built?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I've been studying this for quite a while. I've been working in this industry for the last 6 years, and interviewing a lot of millennial home buyers. But I also recently realized this connection. Before I started my business, I was a social worker, and I worked with very traumatized populations who are often very distrusting of whoever they're working with. And we use a model in that industry called trauma-informed care. And I was looking at the 5 principles of that model, and realized how perfectly they apply to reaching millennials and underserved segments. And so I'm going to walk through some of those, and I think you'll hear how much that resonates with that message today. But the first one, and so it's all about building trust. And the first one is creating a sense of safety. And how do you help the consumer to feel safe in having a conversation with you? That means you're not putting out a ton of sales messages. That means you're really helping to build that brand as a trusted guide. And for millennials, it may be starting that conversation over technology, like, texting to get a phone call, or texting, more information, so that they feel like, okay, I still have control here, and I'm not going to immediately get put in a situation where I'm not ready to have a conversation. Now, I'm a huge proponent of video and in person when you can have those conversations. But it's just getting there and starting to build that trust. And then the second one is transparency. So being completely transparent around the home buying process and what it looks like to work with you, and kind of comprehensive around that. The third is collaboration. So giving the consumer a sense that they are making these decisions for themselves. You're just helping them, you're collaborating with them throughout this process. And even bringing in other collaborators. Like if the consumer, for example, is a millennial who is very close with their parents, offer for their parents or their significant other to join in that initial meeting where you're talking about the home buying process, and just create that open invitation, because we're going to be most influenced by those that are closest to us. And then the fourth is choice. So again, laying out those options, not saying, if you're a loan officer, not saying this is what you need to do, saying here's a few options, and here's what maybe I think is best, or what seems to be a good fit with you, but this is, ultimately your decision. And then fifth is empowerment. So just helping the consumer feel totally empowered in their decision, and not having any kind of surprises, especially if you're not going to be at the closing for whatever reason, or you just want them to feel completely confident going into the home buying process and confident in closing that out.
That's great. And we have some examples of your speaking at igniteadvisorygroup.com, but we've had the privilege of hearing you speak before a large audience and for private companies where there's maybe 50, 60 in a room. And I'm curious, because most of those audiences I've been a part of, I would say probably 80% are not millennials, somewhere around that, if it's even
Mm-hmm.
that, and
Yeah.
maybe even higher. But so what is a win when you go in and have the opportunity to really bring your message about the millennial and the multicultural market? Uh, what's a win for Kristin when you leave there? You say, you know what? I brought the goods. What's a win for you when you're able to speak to a group like that?
I think it's important. Well, number one is creating a sense of empathy and connection with the consumer. I think sometimes if there's a generational gap or just a culture gap, it can be hard to understand, like, why is my customer just not picking up the phone, or why am I not retaining these leads? And when you create a sense of understanding, that I think that really changes the game in your marketing, in your messaging, in your customer experience, all across the board. So that's my number one. But I also always leave several takeaways around specific strategies that you can apply to the customer experience or marketing, whatever the purpose is that I'm there for. But I try to create that sense of connection and empathy with the customer segment that we're talking about, and then leave some really practical takeaways for how they're going to adjust their strategy or customer experience to win that business.
Great. Before we move on to kind of talking about the multicultural side of your speaking opportunities and consulting, what about the different types of social media? How do we reach a millennial if we're in the mortgage or real estate business? And what's the best way, and how's the best way to communicate it?
Yeah, so social media is just part of our daily communication now. And so not using social media is kind of like not using the telephone. Like you have to be active there. And especially during a time when people have decided and have been forced to withdraw a little bit from public gatherings. Social media, has increased so significantly. And it's really important that you are just authentic and providing value in those circles. So it's the same thing as, if you walk into a room or any kind of community gathering, you're not going to go around saying, hey, rates are low, call me, and like, you're not sending these sales messages out like that. You're bringing value to the conversation. You're engaging with people. And that's the most important thing to remember in this sector. So my team creates a lot of social media content that's all financial education focused. And that's what we really try to push, is either, be, depending on your role in the housing industry, provide value around that base of financial education or real estate focused education. And then I think, choose where you're going to be active. It may be, we always recommend Facebook and Instagram. Those are really strong platforms. If you have an interest in Twitter, that's a very different type of platform, but it's there's a lot of people really active there. But we always encourage Facebook and Instagram as a start, and then LinkedIn is great for connections if you're looking for referral partner connections or wanting to build your team. But I think that's the priority there, is to provide value and engage with your audience on those platforms.
Are there other like digital tools that one should be using basically to modernize the way doing business?
Yeah, I think Zoom is a great example, and that's increased significantly through the pandemic. But using things that allow for face-to-face contact when you're not actually in person, that's a really important way to build trust. And when someone can look eye to eye with you, and you just learn a lot more about someone when you're able to do that. So even if you're not super comfortable over video, really encourage you to have as many meetings as possible over video, and then do some video marketing where you're sharing maybe some market updates or whatever it is, answers common questions through video on social media, and even follow-ups to meetings, like texting over a video if you want to say, hey, it was great meeting you, and giving some follow-up items. I think video is the number one extra tool that I would think about. And then also just there's a lot of valuable tools out there, CRMs and things like that that can support your marketing.
That's great. The aspect of the multicultural market, I know that you speak a lot with regard to the Hispanic community, but we're based, Ignite Advisory Group, we're based out of Atlanta, Georgia, a fairly large Hispanic market, but really significantly with Asian countries. Since the Olympics, Atlanta really became a multicultural community. And I know you speak a lot into that. And I might just say, for those that are listening into our podcast today, we're talking with Kristin Messerli. And Kristin is a consultant and does a lot of speaking in the area of home ownership and the mortgage industry. And we as a company have had the privilege of working with her and booking her to some events, and we love working with you, Kristin. And but let's talk a little bit about the multicultural side of your business and your speaking.
Yeah. So my passion is to create equal access to the knowledge and process around homeownership. Of course, sustainable homeownership, but I think the process is often so complicated, and it requires that someone that you trust in the industry to share with you that process. And so that's why I think it's really important in a lot of multicultural communities that's just non-existent. That conversation is non-existent. They don't know people in the industry that they can trust to talk to about this. And so I think it's number one, just really important to build inroads into these communities. And my background in social work, I work primarily in immigrant communities, and that's why I kind of bring that perspective. But it's really like the wealth gap is so significant. African Americans to non-Hispanic whites 10-1 when it comes to wealth, and that drops a little bit with the Hispanic and Latino population. But I think whenever you are able to build trust in these communities, you have access to a huge market that's just completely underserved and untapped. And so it's a big business opportunity, but it's also a really meaningful part of work to be able to provide people with access to this kind of information in a trustworthy way. But it goes back to, you can apply everything I've talked about with the millennial population around using video, following those 5 principles to the trauma-informed care model here. That's building trust in these communities is the number one goal. And it does take a little bit of time to be able to build that trust. But when you do, you have such extreme loyalty. And so, as you mentioned, having people from a lot of different ethnicities, backgrounds, international communities, locally, it's really important that you understand the cultural nuances in each of those areas before you start reaching out, and really, or at least do that alongside that, and realize that everyone is not going to respond to the same messages the way that you might. And so one of my big themes that I talk about is treating others the way that they want to be treated, rather than treating others the way you want to be treated. Because I realized that when I was a social worker, that a lot of times I'd be moving through my appointments really quickly because I would value time and efficiency. And I found out that a lot of my clients wanted to get to know me and wanted me to not have my clipboard out and come around and have a cup of tea with them first. And when I started making some of those small adjustments that was just based on cultural nuance, cultural values, outcomes went through the roof. And that's where I really started finding in real estate and mortgage that opportunity to build those connections in order to gain really extreme loyalty and also opportunity in these segments.
I'm hearing kind of like 3 words throughout our time of talking: trust, relationships, loyalty. These are not natural traits. We want them to be, but so what are you reading? What does Kristin base her, building your trust personally, so that, you can't, it's one thing to say, I'm going to build a trusting relationship. It's another thing to be a trusting person,
Hmm.
So what is it that you're reading, or what books would you recommend? Or just, I'm just thinking, how do we help somebody take that step to become trustworthy, or to
Yeah.
be a loyal friend, not only a loyal advisor?
Yeah, gosh, I'll have to think about the book side of things. I think there needs to be more books on this subject, but I think one of the big areas is just really experiencing the communities that you're wanting to reach, and
Mm,
so going in and eating at the restaurants that of the places where you're wanting to reach, and joining community events, showing up at these kinds of community events like associations or some of the local chambers like Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, those types of things that help you get a better understanding of some of the needs of the community and the culture. So I would say first and foremost the experience, but and when and if you can travel to some of the nationalities and origins of the communities
mm,
that you're reaching locally. And that would be where my experience comes from most of all. I've lived in different countries and had those experiences, but I read a book at the very beginning of my career, and it's hard for me to recommend it because it's been so long since I read it, but it was called Reinventing Diversity.
mm.
And I just absolutely loved like the whole mentality there around. I know that it was really around building trust and relationship. So that might be a recommendation, but I have to think a
Okay.
little bit more about the actual
Reinventing,
book.
reinventing
Diversity.
diversity.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's great. I appreciate that. And I don't want to put, words in your mouth. So if I'm not correct when I say this back to you, but it does seem that people, even though I go online, I'm shopping at Amazon, I'm shopping, I'm like you, I buy everything online. It's like, I can't remember. Well, now, why is why is Amazon Prime showing up today? Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I do that all the time.
but we don't want to be a number.
Hmm.
It's important. This relationship thing that you're talking about is important. So, and you said something that even in the multicultural relationship you had, even was to take time, not just put down the clipboard, and
Hmm.
that carries across into real estate and the mortgage. It's like when I go into the doctor's office, just give me a little time so I know I'm just not a number. And
Yeah.
so how does that play into being a more professional real estate agent, mortgage broker,
Hmm.
with regard to both and especially with the millennials?
Yeah, gosh, that's such an important question. I think you have two options. One is that you are this transaction, you're just a means to the end, and in that you're going to have to always compete on convenience, efficiency, and rate. And that's not a good place to be because someone else is always going to be able to beat you on that side of things. But and it's really not impactful. People are going to come back to you for business or refer you business most likely. The other option is that you are someone's trusted resource and guide through this process, and that requires that relationship. So technology should maximize your time as much as possible to be able to build those relationships. And that's where I think technology is so critical, is around either expanding the relationship so that you can have video calls where you would have previously had phone calls that are less meaningful and connecting, or to be able to text in order to get to those video calls and improve communication that way. Those types of things. And of course, the technology that helps to automate some of your systems so you can focus more on building those relationships. But that's where I think it's really critical to spend your energy. And when I bought my first home, I remember my loan officer. It's easy to forget that buying a home, especially when it's your first one, is a huge deal for the consumer, and it's the biggest financial purchase they've made in their lives. And so they're putting a lot of trust in you, even if it's just as a means to the end. But if you really take that seriously, and I remember my loan officer not showing up at closing. At the time, I didn't know that was pretty common, not to go to a closing. but I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to do this by myself. Like,
Hmm.
also, what? Why is he not here? I don't know. I was surprised, and in surveying and interviewing a lot of other millennial homebuyers, I've heard very common complaints of being surprised at the closing, which blows me away, surprised by maybe some of the payment information, or just being really anxious about it, or the experience being anticlimactic overall. And it's just it's really important that you take that relationship very seriously and do whatever you can to automate everything else so that you can focus on that.
So today we're talking with Kristin Messerli, who's one of her great areas of strength is helping those in the real estate and mortgage industry be successful in serving the millennial community. And like I said earlier, we've been together at a few different conferences and workshops that you've done. And I recall one in Southern California that you spoke at. And as I looked out across the hall of, there were several hundred in there, I would say that there was more white hair, gray hair, so than millennials for sure. Um, and I heard you address this in one of your workshops, but there is a fear factor, right? There is a fear factor on how do I, speaking of myself, how do I communicate? Am I communicating right? Am I sounding old? Am I using words that, so there's this factor that happens on the other side of the desk in communicating with a millennial. And
Mm-hmm.
so how can you help remove that fear factor? And besides having you come in and speak which
Yeah.
we want everybody to have you come in and speak for their organization. And we just love, like I said so many times, booking you into different corporations. But let's get back. How do you handle that, or how do you
Yeah.
encourage somebody like that?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's important to remember that you don't need to be a millennial in order to reach a millennial. I mean, I think a lot of people are just hesitant around thinking like, oh, I don't know, you're disconnected or whatever. Whatever age you are, you can leverage that age for your benefit. If you are a millennial, which, yeah, very often, very few millennials, unfortunately, in the audience, which means that we need to work harder at getting a younger audience in the industry. But yeah, even if you're a millennial, then you can leverage your age and saying and understanding how and where you're getting your friends involved. You're able to maybe communicate a little bit more easily because you already are connected in those communities. But if you're older, you have the opportunity to leverage your experience and expertise. And I think most importantly, millennials are attracted to, as everyone is attracted to, authenticity. When you are yourself, we're going to feel more comfortable working with you. And that's the case just with absolutely anyone in any area of your life. If you feel more comfortable and confident, then others are going to feel more comfortable and confident approaching you. So I think in social media messaging, it's really important not to try to put on a different voice or a different kind of persona out there. Completely be yourself, and that's where
Right.
you're going to be most successful. If you are whatever it is, like even when we talk about social media marketing, for example, a lot of people try to do some kind of certain, or go live and do certain events, and that's cool if you're able to do it in a way that you feel comfortable. But think about things that interest you and that align with your values, and other people are going to join you along the way. So I think it's important to leverage things like, if you aren't texting, aren't using technology or video, those types of things, adopt those tools, because that's going to be really effective with a younger audience. Also everyone, but definitely the younger audience. And then otherwise, be yourself in every possible way.
That is great. Good advice. A question as we wrap up here. Coming through the pandemic, little to no speaking. Pretty much
Yeah.
all of us have been working from home, no travel. But as you begin going out and speaking again, what is the message that you want to bring that's fresh, that's current, that companies, whether in the real estate or mortgage industry, need to hear, and they're only going to really hear it from you?
Yeah, well, I'm actually, I mean, not to belittle the global suffering that's happened as a result of the pandemic, but there's some really cool silver linings when it comes to homeownership in this industry, because millennials in the past, one of the biggest hesitations around homeownership was this idea that they want to be more remote. They want to be able to pick up and move somewhere else really quickly. And I think a lot of people have found that they want some stability. I mean, in times of crisis and high anxiety and fear, people first and foremost want to feel safe and secure and stable. And so homeownership really feeds into that really well. And I think that also a lot of people are going to realize, I want a space that I feel happy in long term, that I can, make my own. And again, homeownership is perfect for that. So I think I think we're going to see a rise in interest, especially as job stability comes back. That towards homeownership with this generation. I think that message, talking through how do you bring leadership in times of fear and uncertainty, is one that I absolutely want to convey in my upcoming speaking engagements, and then how to bring this message of homeownership in a time when people are more distrusting and often fearful of public gatherings, because that means they're gonna retreat more into the home, which means that, again, great for home ownership potentially, but also it means that you have to reach them digitally. And so I'll be talking about those two messages.
Great. Kristin, thank you so much for being part of our Ignite podcast. And I would encourage everybody listening, you can go to igniteadvisorygroup.com, and under the tab that has speakers, we have mortgage and real estate, and there you'll find all the information with regard to Kristin, as well as some samples of some of her talks and interviews. And Kristin, it's been great to have you on our podcast, as I've said, and look forward to having you back again.